At 1 p.m. Eastern on August 24, 2026, Washington was preparing another major financial strike against Iran. And the most important detail was not the list of sanctioned names, the number of vessels, or the language coming from the Treasury Department, but the reaction that began forming around Tehran as pressure intensified. Not a declaration of a new military alliance, not a signed four-country war plan. Something more complicated was taking shape within hours. China openly rejected the pressure campaign. Russia remained tied to Iran through a 20-year strategic partnership, and North Korea had already placed itself politically on Tehran's side, while deepening its own military relationship with Moscow. The three countries are Russia, China, and North Korea, and the real story is not that they have suddenly become Iran's NATO. The real story is that separate networks are beginning to overlap. I'm going to walk you through exactly what is confirmed, why these three relationships matter in very different ways, and why the next phase could become far more dangerous if crises in the Gulf, Europe, and East Asia start feeding into one another. Stay with me for all of it. On this channel, the standard is simple. Separate military reality from political theater, separate public statements from capabilities, and separate what governments want you to believe from what their incentives actually tell us. As of August 25th, there is no credible evidence of a formal Russia, China, North Korea, Iran mutual defense alliance, in which all four governments are obligated to enter a war for one another, and U.S. intelligence itself has warned that describing them as a single unified bloc can overstate the depth of their cooperation. What is confirmed is selective cooperation, mostly bilateral, across trade, sanctions resistance, defense technology, diplomatic cover, intelligence, energy, and military relationships, while some wartime claims remain reported but unverified. No hype, no speculation dressed up as fact. The danger is serious enough without inventing one. Let's get into it. To understand why three countries can move closer to Iran without signing a single dramatic alliance document, you have to understand how power actually works under modern sanctions and modern precision warfare. Because a state under intense pressure does not only need missiles and soldiers. It needs money to keep institutions functioning, trade routes to keep factories supplied, intelligence to keep military systems alive, diplomatic partners to complicate isolation, and alternative technology networks that reduce the effect of Western restrictions. A missile launcher depends on targeting information. Targeting information depends on sensors and communications. Those systems depend on components and software, and the ability to replace those components depends on trade, finance, shipping, and access to outside suppliers. So, disrupting one layer can degrade the entire chain, while restoring even one layer can keep the rest of the system alive much longer than an adversary expected. That is why the word ally can be misleading here. Russia can help Iran in one domain while refusing to fight Iran's war. China can protect commercial access and oppose U.S. sanctions while still trying to avoid a direct military collision with Washington. North Korea can offer political solidarity, a history of missile cooperation, and a model for surviving isolation without possessing the economic weight to rescue Tehran by itself. These are not interchangeable relationships. They are different pieces of strategic depth. And here is the first surprise. The absence of a formal alliance can sometimes make cooperation easier, not harder, because a treaty that requires automatic military intervention creates a clear red line, while a looser network allows each government to contribute where the cost is acceptable and step back where the risk becomes too high. Russia's 20-year strategic partnership with Iran, signed in January 2025 and later approved by Iran's parliament, deepened defense and military technical cooperation, but it did not include the kind of mutual defense clause Russia has with North Korea. That distinction matters enormously. Moscow can coordinate, trade, train, exchange technical expertise, and oppose attempts to isolate Tehran without legally promising that Russian forces will enter combat if Iran is attacked. China's role operates through a different mechanism. Beijing is not useful to Iran because it needs to send Chinese infantry into the Gulf. China is useful because scale is power. Iran's ability to sell oil, access industrial goods, obtain dual-use components, move payments outside Western channels, and preserve enough economic oxygen to survive a long confrontation depends heavily on whether major external markets remain available, and China has been the central buyer of Iranian oil shipped abroad. When Washington expands secondary sanctions, the contest therefore shifts from the battlefield to banks, refineries, shipping companies, insurers, ports, currencies, and every intermediary willing to accept risk. A tanker that reaches a buyer can matter strategically because the revenue eventually becomes salaries, fuel, replacement parts, procurement, and political endurance. North Korea is the smallest economy in this group, but it represents a different kind of problem. Pyongyang has decades of experience building missiles under sanctions, hiding procurement chains, dispersing military infrastructure, and exchanging military support through relationships that outsiders struggle to observe in real time. Historically, North Korea was a major arms supplier to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. And in the current era, its partnership with Russia has become far more operational, with North Korean ammunition, missiles, and troops tied to Moscow's war effort in Ukraine, according to US, South Korean, and Allied assessments. That does not prove North Korea is now shipping weapons directly to Iran. It does mean that technology, battlefield lessons, production methods, and political relationships are moving through a network in which Iran and North Korea are both closely connected to Russia. This is where many analyses get the structure wrong. They look for a single headquarters, a single treaty, or a photograph of 4 leaders, and conclude that if those things do not exist, the alignment is not meaningful. But a modern strategic network can be powerful precisely because it is decentralized. One country buys sanctioned energy, another provides military technical cooperation, another contributes munitions and battlefield experience to a shared partner. All of them oppose at least some dimensions of US pressure. None of them needs to agree on every war, every border, or every political objective for the combined effect to raise the cost of American strategy. This is not a new Warsaw Pact. It is a resilience network. Now let's talk about why that network appears more important in 2026 than it did only a few years ago, because the underlying incentives have changed. Russia's invasion of Ukraine made Moscow much more dependent on outside ammunition, drones, electronics, trade routes, and sanctions evasion mechanisms, while Iran's own confrontations with Israel and the United States increased Tehran's need for air defense, intelligence, replacement components, and economic partners. North Korea gained leverage by supplying Russia and learning from a real industrial war. China watched all of this while becoming more concerned with the precedent of Western sanctions, maritime pressure, and technology restrictions that could someday be used against Beijing during a Taiwan crisis. Separate motives began producing overlapping behavior. The sequence is important. On January 17, 2025, Russia and Iran signed their comprehensive strategic partnership, a 20-year framework designed to deepen cooperation across defense, energy, trade, transport, finance, and regional diplomacy. The agreement was not a promise that Russian forces would automatically defend Iran, and that limit was deliberate, but it created a much thicker institutional channel between two heavily sanctioned states. By May 2025, Iran's parliament had approved the pact, and the message was clear. Tehran and Moscow were preparing for a relationship that could outlast any single battlefield crisis. Then came the next phase. During the major conflicts that followed, U.S. intelligence assessed that Iran expected more direct backing from Russia, China, and North Korea than it actually received. And this is one of the most important facts in the entire story because it cuts against the most sensational version of the title. When Iran faced direct U.S. and Israeli military pressure, the 3 countries did not collectively enter the war. Russia did not launch a conventional military intervention. China did not announce that it would fight American forces. North Korea did not trigger a treaty obligation with Tehran because no such treaty exists. But the story did not stop there. On March 10, 2026, North Korea publicly backed Iran's selection of its new supreme leader and condemned U.S. and Israeli strikes, an act of political solidarity that cost Pyongyang little militarily, but signaled which side it wanted the world to see it standing on. Around the same period, Russia continued emphasizing strategic ties with Iran while avoiding a direct clash with the United States. Beijing publicly called for restraint and diplomacy, but its economic relationship with Tehran remained central, and later reporting raised questions about whether Chinese-linked support could extend into air defense or other dual-use capabilities, claims that require caution because the details are harder to independently verify than oil flows or official diplomatic statements. Then the pressure shifted again. By late July and August, the Strait of Hormuz, tanker traffic, oil pricing, sanctions enforcement, and the security of regional bases had become part of the same strategic equation. Washington moved toward what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described as extraordinarily severe sanctions designed to isolate Iran's economy and deter countries from doing business with Tehran. That threat was not aimed only at Iran. Secondary sanctions are designed to force a choice on third parties, keep access to the U.S.-centered financial system, or keep certain relationships with the target state and accept the consequences. And critically, China did not simply salute and comply. On August 24th, Beijing said it would protect its legitimate rights and interests, and again rejected unilateral pressure as a solution to the conflict. The United States, meanwhile, faced a difficult calibration problem because sanctioning small refiners is one thing, while attempting to punish major Chinese financial institutions can create consequences far beyond Iran, including retaliation, financial fragmentation, trade disruption, and pressure on an already fragile geopolitical relationship between Washington and Beijing. Roughly a day later, another signal appeared from an entirely different direction. Pakistan announced significant progress in talks with Iran aimed at de-escalation, while also maintaining communication with Washington. That does not make Pakistan one of the 3 countries in this story, and it certainly does not place Islamabad in an anti-American military bloc. In fact, it shows how much of the region is trying to avoid being forced into a binary choice. At the same time, the United States began returning personnel to several Middle Eastern diplomatic posts after earlier reductions, suggesting that officials saw at least some decrease in immediate risk, even while the underlying confrontation remained unresolved. Here's the piece almost nobody is explaining correctly. The timeline does not show 3 countries marching into Iran's war. It shows 3 tracks developing at the same time. Russia, giving Tehran strategic and military technical depth without a mutual defense guarantee. China, preserving economic and diplomatic space while resisting the extraterritorial reach of U.S. sanctions. And North Korea reinforcing the political and military ecosystem around Russia while signaling solidarity with Iran. Those 3 tracks are separate, but they intersect through Moscow, sanctions networks, weapons technology, energy flows, and a shared interest in limiting American coercive power. That is the mechanism. And if this breakdown is giving you the distinction between headlines and actual strategic behavior that short clips usually miss, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell, because this story is changing across multiple theaters at once. And the next important development may not come from Tehran at all. It may come from a Chinese bank, a Russian military shipment, a North Korean test site, or a shipping incident in the Gulf. Let's zoom out to what this means, because the first consequence is local and immediate. Iran becomes harder to isolate completely. That does not mean Tehran becomes invulnerable, and it does not erase damage to its military infrastructure, economy, leadership, or internal stability. But external relationships can change how quickly degraded capabilities are restored and how long a government can withstand pressure. If spare parts can be sourced, oil can still reach buyers, banking channels can be improvised, intelligence can be shared, and diplomatic partners can block or dilute isolation, then the timeline for coercion changes. A campaign designed to force rapid capitulation can turn into a long contest of endurance. The second consequence moves outward to U.S. and Israeli military planning. If Iran's reconstruction depends partly on foreign components, intelligence, technical support, and revenue, then striking launchers or production sites is only one layer of the problem. The next layer becomes interdiction. Which shipments are military? Which are civilian? Which companies are fronts? Which satellites are providing commercially available imagery rather than state intelligence? Which banking transactions cross the line from legal commerce into sanctions evasion? Every answer creates another decision point, and every decision point creates another opportunity for escalation with a country that was not originally a combatant. That is how a regional war starts acquiring global edges. Imagine the problem from Moscow's perspective. Russia does not need a direct war with the United States over Iran, especially while it remains consumed by Ukraine and its own confrontation with NATO. But it has an incentive to prevent a strategic partner from being completely broken by American pressure, because a weaker Iran would reduce Russian influence in the Middle East, weaken a partner in sanctions resistance, and potentially free U.S. attention and military resources for other theaters. So Moscow's rational strategy can be support below the threshold of direct intervention. Diplomatic cover, technical cooperation, intelligence relationships, trade, and assistance that raises Iran's resilience without forcing Russia into a shooting war with American forces. Now look at Beijing. China's nightmare is not simply losing Iranian oil. Its larger concern is a world in which Washington can use military power, dollar dominance, shipping restrictions, export controls, and secondary sanctions as a single integrated coercive system. Because Chinese strategists have to ask how those same tools might be applied during a future crisis around Taiwan or the South China Sea. Supporting Iran too openly risks a confrontation China does not want. Allowing Iran to be economically strangled without resistance creates a precedent China may also dislike. So Beijing has incentives to push back selectively, especially in trade, finance, diplomacy, and sanctions policy, while keeping enough distance to preserve room for negotiation. North Korea's incentives are more disruptive. Pyongyang benefits when American attention is divided, when Russia needs North Korean military production, and when sanctions-resistant states demonstrate that isolation can be survived through alternative networks. The deeper North Korea's relationship with Russia becomes, the more opportunities there are for exchanges in missile performance, air defense, electronic warfare, satellite support, industrial production, and battlefield adaptation, even if not every technology transfer is visible or confirmed. For Iran, that matters because a state does not need a direct bilateral shipment to benefit eventually from lessons circulating through a partner network. Now move one level outward to the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most sensitive maritime choke points on the planet, and the same pressure point we have covered repeatedly in our analysis of U.S.-Iran escalation becomes more dangerous when outside powers have larger economic stakes in the outcome. China depends heavily on Gulf energy. European and Asian economies depend on stable shipping. Gulf monarchies need security but also need trade and predictable relations with neighbors. If tanker traffic falls, insurance costs rise, ports become politically contested, or sanctions enforcement expands at sea, energy prices can react long before governments decide they are in a wider war. Then comes the national to regional feedback loop. Higher oil prices strain importers. Shipping disruptions raise inflation. Inflation changes domestic politics. Domestic political pressure changes military decision-making. Governments that initially wanted a limited confrontation become less patient, while governments trying to mediate face pressure from both sides. The battlefield is no longer only a map of missile ranges. It becomes a map of refineries, sea lanes, currencies, elections, supply chains, and alliance credibility. And that is where the World War III question has to be answered carefully. Are we closer to a global war simply because Russia, China, and North Korea are cooperating with Iran in different ways? No, that conclusion goes beyond the evidence. But are we building a system in which separate conflicts can become connected faster than before? Yes, and that is the part that deserves attention. World war is not a switch. It is a coupling problem. The most dangerous scenario is not 4 leaders sitting in a room and announcing a coordinated attack on the West. The most dangerous scenario is a chain reaction in which one theater creates obligations, opportunities, or fears in another. A U.S. interdiction action against a shipment connected to Russia triggers retaliation somewhere else. A Chinese company or bank becomes the target of severe secondary sanctions, and Beijing responds with economic measures that spill into another security dispute. A North Korean escalation on the Korean peninsula forces the United States to shift air and naval assets at the same moment tensions in the Gulf are rising. Russia increases pressure in Europe, while Washington is distracted in the Middle East. None of these steps requires a master plan. They only require actors to exploit each other's crises. Here's another way to see it. During the Cold War, Washington and Moscow built formal alliance systems with clear structures, known bases, declared commitments, and recognizable chains of command. Today's emerging challenge is messier. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea do not trust one another enough to behave like a single military organization, and their interests often diverge sharply. But selective cooperation can still create cumulative pressure on the same adversary. If each actor forces the United States to hold more forces in reserve, spend more on munitions, protect more bases, monitor more shipping, defend more networks, and sustain more sanctions enforcement, then the combined effect can be strategically significant even without coordinated combat. This is not unity, it is convergence. And convergence changes deterrence because Washington has to calculate not only what Iran will do after a strike, but what Russia may provide afterward, what China may refuse to restrict, what North Korea may learn or transfer through Moscow, and whether pressure in one theater will invite opportunism in another. Tehran has to calculate whether outside partners will actually support it when the risk becomes real, especially after evidence that previous expectations of direct assistance were disappointed. Moscow has to calculate how far it can help without provoking American retaliation. Beijing has to calculate where economic self-interest ends and strategic confrontation begins. Pyongyang has to calculate how much chaos improves its leverage without creating a war it cannot control. Those are unstable calculations, because every actor is working with incomplete information. I want to be honest with you about something. When a title asks whether World War III is closer, it can be tempting to turn every diplomatic meeting, every shipment, and every angry statement into proof that a global war is already forming. But that kind of analysis does not make you better informed. It makes you easier to frighten. The people living under missiles, the sailors moving through contested waters, the families dealing with inflation and shortages, the soldiers stationed at exposed bases, and the civilians trying to survive political decisions made far above them do not experience escalation as an abstract geopolitical game. There is also real uncertainty here. Governments exaggerate support, conceal weakness, deny transfers, leak selective intelligence, and use public messaging to deter adversaries or reassure domestic audiences, which means some of the most dramatic claims will remain contested until long after the events themselves. That uncertainty is not a reason to ignore risk. It is a reason to describe the risk precisely. Understanding why Russia, China, and North Korea may help Iran resist isolation does not require pretending they are bound to fight and die for Tehran. Understanding why U.S. and Israeli planners see those relationships as a strategic problem does not require pretending every sanction, strike, or interdiction is automatically justified. Both things are true at once. Here's where we stand. At 1 p.m. Eastern on August 24th, Washington was preparing another major financial strike against Iran, but the bigger picture was already visible around the edges. Not a declaration of a 4-country alliance, not an automatic mutual defense pact, but 3 separate relationships beginning to overlap under pressure. Russia has a 20-year strategic partnership with Iran and a record of deepening military technical cooperation, yet no treaty obligation to enter Iran's war. China remains the economic giant in the equation, especially through oil, trade, and opposition to unilateral sanctions, but it continues to balance support for its interests against the danger of direct confrontation with the United States. North Korea has openly signaled political solidarity with Tehran and is becoming more militarily integrated with Russia. But evidence of a new direct North Korea to Iran wartime pipeline remains much thinner than the most dramatic headlines suggest. The danger, then, is not that World War III has already begun in secret. The danger is that the architecture for faster escalation is becoming easier to see. A sanctions dispute can become a banking confrontation. A banking confrontation can become a shipping confrontation. A shipping confrontation can become a military incident. A military incident can pull entreaty allies, force deployments across theaters, and create opportunities for rival powers to move at the same time. Cascading risk does not require conspiracy. It requires pressure, uncertainty, and one bad decision after another. If this gave you a level of context you cannot get from a 30-second headline clip, share it right now with someone trying to actually understand what is happening, because the difference between a formal alliance and a selective strategic network is not academic. It changes how we should think about deterrence, escalation, and what warning signs matter next. And I want your view on the hardest question in this story. If Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran continue increasing selective cooperation without ever creating a formal alliance, at what point does the practical effect become more important than the legal label? And what single development would convince you that the risk of a truly global confrontation had crossed into a new phase? Drop your take below. I read every comment and hit like if this analysis delivered real value. The next update to watch is not necessarily another missile launch. Watch for the first clear sign that one of these relationships crosses a threshold it has so far avoided. A confirmed major weapons transfer to Iran, direct operational intelligence support, large-scale sanctions retaliation by China, or a Russian commitment that begins to look less like partnership and more like defense. That is the moment the story changes.